Hi, and welcome to the Progressive Hub Show. I'm Sam Rosenthal. I'm the political director at Roots Action. Here with me is Jeff Cohen, the co-founder of Roots Action, and Hanieh Jodat, who's a strategist with Diffuse Nuclear War. Thanks you both for being here today.
Nice to be with you.
Thank you for having us.
So let's jump right into it. The big news of the week, of course, is we have a raft of Supreme Court decisions coming out. They're all very reactionary. These are bad decisions for working people, for working Americans, people of color in this country. And they're really being dictated by a group of 9 people, really 6 individuals who weren't elected, were appointed by presidents, many of whom are relics from the past. But nevertheless, they are dictating the strictures of American society in ways that are really punitive to lots of people in this country. And I think it's very perplexing for the casual observer to think about, how did we get here? Lots of folks who don't follow the Supreme Court probably don't even know how we arrived at this place. So maybe it makes sense to sort of jump into a little bit of history first, talking about how we got to this reactionary ultra-majority on the Supreme Court. And is there any path forward for people who want to see progress in this country? Jeff, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that the Supreme Court has shown in the last week or so that it's acting in a more powerful way than Congress or the White House. And we got here because Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, has packed the court in an unprecedented way. That you might remember in 2016, when the right-wing Justice Scalia died. And he died about 9 months before the presidential election of 2016. And about 8 months before the presidential election, President Obama nominated Merrick Garland. So they had month after, the Senate is supposed to have months to do advise and consent. And they had it. But McConnell wouldn't allow Obama's justice nominee to be even discussed or debated within a committee. So that's how they got one of their right-wingers on the court. That's Gorsuch. And then jump forward 4 years, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies in mid-September. People started voting for the president 2 weeks later. So in that case, there was not sufficient time for the Senate under the Constitution to do its duty of advising and consenting about the U.S. Supreme Court nominee, but they shoved through Coney Barrett. So what should be today a 5-4 liberal court is a 6-3 right-wing court. It's completely a result of court packing. And Biden has been prevailed upon by members of Congress in the Democratic Party to do something to unpack the court packing that Mitch McConnell has accomplished. And what some of them, Senator Markey, Congressman Nadler, who's a power on the Judiciary Committee for the Democrats, they want Biden to unpack the court, and they've been saying this for more than a year or so, unpack the court by adding 4 justices, so we get to a 13. And it would be a way of undoing the unprecedented court packing that McConnell did. And with the Supreme Court just deciding we're going to make policy, we're going to find, usually, I went to law school. It's hard for the Supreme Court usually to find someone has standing. It's usually a big stumbling block, an obstacle, a hurdle. Does this person have standing to even question this law? Well, they gave the state of Missouri the right to question the college debt cancellation of Biden. And they let a woman, I don't even think she'd started her business yet, to have standing to challenge the rights of LGBTQ people to be free of discrimination and to be served at businesses. So we're in a real mess. There would be a way to fix it. The way to fix it would be to expand the Supreme Court, the number of justices. By the way, the number of Supreme Court justices has gone up and down, I think 7 or 8 times through US history. So if it were to be done today to undo this tragedy of right-wing court packing in a completely hypocritical way. I mean, everyone knows it. McConnell knows it. We should have a 5-4 liberal majority. None of these reactionary things would be happening today, except for McConnell breaking all the old rules to pack the court. And the only way to deal with what McConnell's done is to expand the court at this point.
Right. And I sort of remember them making this very specious argument back with Coney Barrett about, oh, well, Trump could have another term, so his term isn't running out the way Obama was, and that's why we're okay with this. But to me, it's a classic example of, the Democrats failing to bring a knife to the knife fight again and getting rolled in the process. Hanieh, I want to ask you, and Jeff just alluded to this, but oftentimes discussions of Supreme Court decisions get very bogged down in legalese, and people like to sort of parse the arguments and think about what they mean for legal precedent. But there are very real effects from these decisions that happen immediately. I mean, people's lives change overnight, as we saw with the Dobbs decision in the last term. And so can you just talk a little bit about, what it means that these decisions are coming down now, and some of the decisions that really are sort of, affecting the lives of working people right now?
Right. Yeah. And kind of just to piggyback off of what Jeff was saying, the President of the United States has the authority to forgive student loan debt under the Higher Education Relief Opportunities for Student Acts of 2003. We're talking about $10,000 here that they're hoping to forgive. So that's not much when you think about really the impact of what student loans have on people's day-to-day lives. And we're also talking about how student loans impact women of color mainly and mostly, right, in this country. There are instances where students who speak to advisors at private universities who do not even know that student loans are accruing interest on a month-to-month basis, right? And this is now a matter of, if I cannot pay my student loans after I graduate, right? Because we still don't even have a livable wage in this country. So someone who graduates with a 4-year degree who is, $50,000, $60,000 in debt from a private from a private school, they can't even pay that back on a monthly basis, right? So we're talking about student loans that are accruing interest on a monthly basis that can raise up to $100,000. We're talking about people going into a defaulted status. And a lot of times when you go into a defaulted status, that money, that student loan comes out of your wages and your taxes. So we're talking about garnishment of wages on a monthly basis, almost up to 10%. Garnishment of taxes as well, right? A lot of times people file for their taxes. If they're in a defaulted status with their student loans, they don't get that money back in return. And those taxes can actually provide food, a roof over somebody's head. So the fact that in the richest country in the history of the world, we're talking about $10,000 being an issue when the President of the United States built upon that promise to get the votes of the working class Americans and has waited for so long to actually put these promises into action, right? At a time where we are spending $150 billion almost on our Pentagon spending and wars overseas, right? We're talking about taking away the livelihood from the working class Americans. That to me is a moral issue, right? And you talked about the expansion of the court, Jeff, in such an eloquent way, but I'm thinking as someone who's been a student in the past, right? What are we doing for the working class Americans?
Yeah,
and how is it impacting them? Yeah.
Let me weigh in as the only senior of the three of us. When I went to a public university in 1969, the tuition was $230 a semester. College dorm was cheap. In my era, before higher education was so defunded, public higher education has been defunded ever since the 70s. So working class and middle class families could put their kids through public universities in my era, and you didn't go into debt. I didn't know anyone who took out a college loan. And that's because the society said, we're going to place a high value on higher education. And Hanieh, you mentioned the military budget, which is something Roots Action's been campaigning against, the bloated military budget, but it's nearing $900 billion. And when you look at per year, and it's going to keep going up, when you look at other societies, other industrialized societies, universal health care is common. Inexpensive or free higher education is common. The main reason that we don't have universal health care and free or inexpensive higher education is because, unlike all these other countries, we have this totally bloated military budget, something that mainstream media doesn't debate, whether it's Fox News or MSNBC.
Right. And Jeff, we're not even talking about here, we're just talking about public schools. We're not talking about private loans here, right? That's a whole different story, because at least, there are some forgiveness programs for federal student loans based on your budget. They sometimes consider 10% of your income when they do your monthly payments, which is still a lot, right, for a lot of people, right? And look, a lot of people don't even want to go into law school or medical school because they don't want to pay the $500,000 loan back, right? So we're really depriving our society from building based upon that value on education, really, Jeff. And we're putting the corporate interest, at the forefront of this rather than the people in America, by not taxing and fairly, as well as the who ends up profiting here is Navient. Who ends up profiting here is Great Lakes, these student loan debt companies who build their empires. And granted, they go through lawsuits every single year, right? But no one hears about it because they're cheating students.
And I think I like that you're talking about the impact on society, because what we lose is we just don't have enough nurses in society. We don't have enough social workers. We don't have enough teachers. We don't, you've got people that are making decisions. Again, in my generation, middle-class people could go to universities. The University of Michigan, where I went, was considered an elite university, but it was public. And you could go so cheaply. But I've been a college lecturer for decades. And so often people would come up to me in the last 30 years and say, yeah, I'm in law school. I'm going to take my first job at a corporate law firm to pay off my debt. And then I'm going to be a public defender. It doesn't happen. So in a sense, this inflated, that all of these people going into debt is not only depriving society of needed professionals and service workers with good skills, it's also causing lawyers and doctors to go in certain directions where they could be actually serving the broader public interest, more working class people as well.
Frank about something too, Jeff. So thank you for mentioning that. I think the DNC is you asked Sam what can be done about this. Yes, expansion of the Supreme Court is very important. But I think, like, when you take a step back, I think that the DNC should actually allow debates for progressive candidates who may be running during this election season to debate Biden on why he hasn't kept a lot of his promises, why he in fact has been he's been the only president, well, not the only president, I would say, but he's provided more drilling permits than Trump has in terms of environmental justice. So, there are things that the DNC could do. There is such a thing called democracy, which is what we're hoping to really achieve in this country. We preach about it all the time to the globe, but we don't really practice what we preach. Why not have it?
And I'd like to say that right after this decision came invalidating the $10,000 of student debt cancellation and up to $20,000 if you're a Pell Grant recipient, immediately Senator Schumer, who's not exactly a left-winger, and Senator Warren, they put out statements saying the Biden administration has got to immediately come up with a different plan to provide student cancellation, debt cancellation. And that certainly those of us at Roots Action, and Sam helped lead our campaign with India Walton, we need to really get back on the Biden administration that they need to do something immediately. They need plan B. And apparently that pressure had some impact before and could have some impact again.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue into the next thing I want to talk about. And you've both got there already. But, this is one of Biden's sort of signature domestic policy achievements. I think we feel on the left in this country that he doesn't have a whole lot to run on right now. He's staring down the barrel of his reelection campaign. It's coming up very quickly. And I just want to show some recent polling quickly that, we've been beating this drum for a while, but the polling for President Biden is really bad, and it's not getting better as we get closer to the election. So here are some head-to-head polls with Biden trailing Trump by 4 points, 3 points. He's even with DeSantis or slightly ahead of him in a different poll. And these are all done within the last week. So these are current polls. This one has Trump up by 7 points. And as you keep going, we even have some state polls. Here's the critical state of Pennsylvania. We have Trump ahead by a point in this poll. So it's still early, but, it's worth reminding everyone, this is head-to-head polling against a former president who is under indictment for federal charges. And Biden is still trailing him by, 2 points, 3 points, 4 points. And these were all taken before the student debt decision as Biden's domestic policy agenda continues to crumble. So what does this mean for Joe Biden's reelection chances? And is it a good time once again to consider whether the Democrats should earnestly search for another candidate? Jeff, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the reason we just announced at Roots Action that we've got this stepasidejoe.org campaign is because we're so fearful of the victory of the neo-fascists in November 2024. If you get all of your news from MSNBC, CNN, or NPR, you have this image of Biden as he's the second coming of FDR, and he's always fighting for major accomplishments. Well, that's not how he's seen by the swing voters. That's not how he's seen. He's seen as weak, as over the hill, as someone who vacillates. And the Republican extremism proved in the wake of the Dobbs decision, the Supreme Court decision ending the right to abortion as a nationwide right, the extremism of the right wing will let Democrats to go so far, even if they don't have a candidate or they don't have a decent candidate. But it's not in a presidential election, it becomes person A versus person B. And if person A is Joe Biden, who's seen universally as weak, that most the 90% of Democrats under 30 want some other Democratic candidate other than Biden. And as Hanieh was saying, the recent environmental choices made by the Biden administration almost seems like they're intending to do voter suppression of their most loyal base, which is young people, as well, obviously Black voters and Black women voters, but young voters really turned out in 2022 in the congressional elections against the extremism of the right wing. But now you have Biden drilling in the Arctic, he's drilling in the Gulf, he's expanded liquefied natural gas exports, he's promoting those. The scientists keep saying you need to keep the fossil fuel in the ground. And a lot of young activists who could be the most important activists in deciding who will win the November 2024 presidential election, they're utterly frustrated with Biden. So, obviously at Roots Action, it's step aside Joe, open up the primary process. We want debates. We want a lot of Democratic candidates, not just the three we have. And, we're going to work hard in the next few months to try to get Biden to step aside.
Yeah, the thing that concerns me the most is, when I think about what it looked like when Biden was running for president in 2020, I knew a lot of folks who were members of progressive organizations who had progressive politics who nonetheless turned out to support Biden because they knew that a second Trump term was such an existential threat to the country that they had to be out in the streets. They were knocking doors in swing states. They were calling voters. They were text banking. And I think that those are the folks who drove the victory for Biden. It was members of labor unions. It was working class people, people of color, and young voters who were really turning out. And beyond just voting, we hear we have to vote all the time, vote like your life depends on it. But what we really need to do is we need to go out and talk to voters. And that's the extra step that you won't see a lot of, wealthier liberal types doing often, is really getting out in the streets, sacrificing their personal time. And so when I think about this upcoming election, I'm really worried that that energy won't be there anymore, that a lot of the, as you're saying, Jeff, people who turned out, the environmentalists who turned out to support Biden, won't be there anymore. Hanieh, you talk to a lot of different groups. You talk to a lot of youth organizers. What do you think the mood is right now among progressives and people who maybe didn't think Biden was an ideal candidate in 2020, but knew they had to beat Trump? What's the feeling like?
I think, Sam, we always get to a point in our voting process in every presidential election is where we have to vote for the lesser of two evils, right? I think a lot of us who were very excited about Bernie Sanders had to rally behind Biden because we knew exactly, me and myself, just to give you a quick example, my mom was impacted by the travel ban. She wasn't here for the birth of my child. And then 5 years later, once that was lifted, then she was able to process her application to show up. But she missed quite a bit of my son's growing up and the memories he makes as a child growing up needing his grandmother here. So I'll say, and that's what I fear, is that we are constantly worried about who is less dangerous for the country, and that's what we vote for. The mood is somber. I mean, we're talking about student loans. These are kids that are impacted. We're not exactly leaving the best planet for our Gen Z, right? And which is why progressive ideologies really resonate with them, right? They want to talk about student loan forgiveness. They do want to, have a planet where they can actually live to get to 50 or 60 years of age, right? They want to be able to afford to buy a home, right? And unfortunately, right now, when we're not even giving them a livable wage, that is something that is not even in there. They don't even think that far about it. They're just continuing to survive. We're not even talking about the poor and barely middle class Americans who work 3-4 jobs, at $7, 50 cents to put food on their children's table, and they go to bed hungry every single night, right? So, the enthusiasm that we had with when Bernie was running is not there anymore, right? And the fact that the Democratic Party, the DNC, is not allowing for debate is actually really unfair, because we have to continue challenging a sitting president as progressives. We have to have candidates that bring about policies that challenge Biden's current position on certain things. In any democracy, the American people deserve different candidates to listen to hear, and to get behind. And right now, the DNC is blocking all of that, right? And what I'm mostly concerned about is the leadership in unions and some of these, I don't want to say progressive organizations, but organizations mainly, who are endorsing Biden without even seeing if there's another candidate that's going to rise up to take on the challenge, right? So if the Biden administration does not deliver on the promises that he made, right, or they made, there is going to be there are going to be millions of people sitting out, right? And we are going to see another Trump presidency, a man who's been indicted, who literally took this country to its lowest points morally, right? And it poses a threat globally as well. We're going to see more wars. We're probably going to see, and Senator Nina Turner always says, what impacts us here impacts us there, what impacts us there impacts us here, right? And I fear for that. But I really will want to ask union leadership to really reconsider endorsing so quickly, because a lot of them are also concerned about what Biden hasn't delivered on, but they're scared that they're not going to get the resources that they need to continue the work that they're doing. And that's dangerous in any democracy. So
I was interviewed yesterday by a mainstream reporter, and I was reminding him that in the year 2000, there were so many Democratic candidates governors, Congress members, senators, that they couldn't fit on the same stage, that they had to have debates on 2 nights. And yet, because people felt invested in that process, and because the base was able to have some influence, when people were asked, how many of you are for Medicare for all, a bunch of hands went up, even though they might have not really fully been behind Medicare for all. But because the base can play a role in a open process of primaries and debates, I think is why the DNC is so afraid. And I'm one who believes it's not divisive if Biden would step aside. I think we know the governor of California is going to immediately jump in, perhaps the governor of Michigan, perhaps several senators, and then the base would be able to start making demands. And it wouldn't be a coronation for Biden. And then whoever that candidate is, there would be more investment. All right, we had an open process. Let's rally around the candidate. But here the DNC is expecting young activists and racial justice activists and working class activists to get out and campaign for Biden after he's been imposed on us rather than selected by us. And it's a big difference. And I'm scared for the future in November 2024.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the other part of sort of the consent manufacturing process, because we have the DNC on the one hand, who, as you say rightfully, Hanieh, is, putting their thumb on the scale, to put it lightly. I mean, they're basically stifling conversation about this. But the other part of this has to do with media consensus. And as you say, Jeff, in 2020, there was this huge field of candidates, and the media enjoyed covering a big field of candidates because they sort of had cover from the DNC powers that be to do so. It was an open primary and there was no incumbent Democratic president. But now what we're seeing is this constant, steady drip of positive news about Biden. The sense that Biden is inevitable, a second term presidency is inevitable. He beat Trump once. He's had all these great domestic policy achievements, which I think increasingly is not reflective of the reality on the ground or the mood of voters. And I think that, it would be great if we could spend a little time just talking about the role that the media plays, and even media that we identify as sort of left-wing or liberal in this country, what role that media in particular plays in creating this air of inevitability around Biden. Could you just talk about that a little bit, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, most liberals, most Democrats get their news from MSNBC, CNN, NPR, PBS, New York Times, Washington Post, Associated Press. That's where they get their news. And that's sort of the wing of the corporate media. That's the mainstream corporate, it's the media wing of the mainstream corporate elite. And then you have Fox News and the others. That's the media for the right wing of the corporate elite. But in the mainstream corporate media, you've had something going on month after month after month, which is this protection of Joe Biden, this exaggeration of what he's accomplished, and this minimization of his weaknesses. So if you remember during the 2019-2020 debates, when Joe Biden during some debates was almost incoherent, and immediately they'd go to the pundits analyzing the debate, I don't think Joe Biden hurt himself at all tonight, and it was laughable then. And it's become sort of tragic now that the swing voters, they're not reading the New York Times. The voters, the working class voters you need to reach, and the poor people of color you need to turn out. They're not reading the Times. They're not getting NPR. It's not like, the people, swing voters or occasional voters, are immersed in mainstream media. And what they see is a president very different than the one that the corporate liberal media is projecting. They see a president who's weak, a president who hasn't generally delivered for them. And so that's the problem we have. And I spent enough years in mainstream TV news to know that Joe Biden is their perfect candidate, because the people who run corporate media like Comcast owns MSNBC and Disney owns ABC News. These people want a corporate Democrat in power who will say occasional nice things about diversity, but will never change the economic relations of society, will never raise taxes fundamentally on the wealthy, will never raise taxes or regulate big corporations. He's the perfect candidate, the perfect president for the mainstream wing of the corporate media.
Yeah, and I was thinking also, sort of, watching the media operate the last few weeks. The other really big story prior to the Supreme Court decisions, of course, was the sort of attempted coup in Russia or whatever that ended up being. But how there was this sense, and you saw it on left liberal media, even more arguably than you saw it on right-leaning media, but that there was this gleefulness about the potential that Putin may be overthrown, which I don't think, now knowing what we know, was probably never really on the table, but just the idea that, he was being sort of threatened by this head of this group, this paramilitary organization. And it struck me as such a myopic way of looking at this, like this idea that this guy who's operating this clandestine paramilitary organization, largely comprised of ex-convicts, recent convicts who are engaged in shadow wars all over the world, really. I mean, in Africa and the Middle East, that this would somehow be a preferable leader. But just the idea that Putin is such this boogeyman that has been built up around Russiagate, especially by stations like MSNBC, that it was, they were barely restrained in their glee about, the possibility that Putin may be overthrown. And Hanieh, you're someone who you come from an international background. You've observed a lot the way the media shapes narratives around other countries in the world. I think, a few specific ones that you follow. But what effect does that have on like the U.S. viewership, American viewership, when we see the media in our country framing things in a particular way? What effect does that have on American viewers?
We've struggled when Iraq and Afghanistan war cost trillions of dollars. Hundreds of thousands of people died as a result of that war. Brown people were vilified. There were movies that came out about us portraying us as terrorists, right? Hollywood made a lot of money off of our backs. That's something we can't deny, right? The mainstream media did the same exact thing, right? So we saw brown and Black children as villains, their parents horrible. So that gave us the opportunity to put our military contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan for decades and kill more people and take out resources. We see something completely different with the Ukraine war. It hurts me deeply that our children were somehow, because of the color of their skin, were the ones that weren't prioritized, right? And that impacted us here as well with the Patriot Act and laws that were heavily discriminatory against Black and brown people here, especially people from the Middle East. And then we see this glorification of blonde children who, again, I am, as someone who's lived through a war, I will say this now publicly, I am anti any war anywhere in this world, right? We want to promote more peace. We want to be diplomatic. We want to promote more diplomacy. The way the corporate media portrays this, what's happening right now, for example, with Ukraine, in comparison with people in Iraq and what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan for such a long time, is very biased. I mean, you see it. It's very obvious, right, that we see these ads come out about how children who are dying, in Ukraine right now and look, I again, like I said, I hate war because I've seen the impacts of it personally, but there's also a bias, when we talk about certain wars and certain people of, different color or ethnicities in comparison to, what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think it does shape an American view when you are constantly vilifying and portraying brown people as these horrible, war-loving, terrorist-supporting people, versus others who are these angels that haven't done anything wrong. Like, so the American person, like the person who doesn't read the Time, for example, person who can't get over the paywall to read the Washington Post, they, they built their view of the unknown, which we were, the brown people back then, as the unknown, these horrible people, as people who are here to take jobs. These are people who are not great people. These are people who want war. These are people who promote, who support terrorism, versus others who are glorified here. So there is a psychological impact that this bias in the corporate media has on people who are of a different skin color.
And Jeff, I was just going to say, Jeff, that so you were very close to sort of the mainstream media machinery around the time of the Iraq War invasion. What do you see as the big differences between the way this war in Ukraine is being covered versus, U.S. Incursions into the Middle East in the very beginning of the 21st century?
Yeah, well, it's night and day. I mean, I lost my job at MSNBC. I was an on-air pundit and a senior producer because we were asking questions about whether to invade Iraq. And I was there in mainstream news. I was at Fox when 9/11 happened and the US invaded Afghanistan. And when the US invaded Afghanistan, everyone knows that there were these CNN memos from the heads of CNN to every anchor, basically saying you need to play down Afghan civilian toll. And if they ever alluded to an Afghan civilian who was killed, the anchors had to repeat the same saying over and over. And in a memo, it said, this may start sounding rote, but you have to do it, which is the US invasion of Afghanistan is in result of a terrorist attack that killed 5,000 Americans. You had to say that every time. And so there's always been in the mainstream media, everyone in the newsroom knows it, that you're supposed to look away from civilians that are the victims of US military. That's a given. So then when Russia's horrific invasion of Ukraine happened, all of a sudden, these same journalists that I worked with and anchors like Lester Holt at NBC News, these same people I worked with, all of a sudden, all they could cover was the civilian victims of the invasion, meaning the Ukrainian victims of the horrific and criminal Russian invasion. You saw, gee, this is what coverage should be. In modern warfare, it's not World War I anymore. In modern warfare, it's not like soldiers shooting at each other and the civilians are off to the side. The main victims are usually civilians. And the main victims of US invasions have been civilians, whether it was the US invading Panama in 1989, invading Iraq in 2003, invading Afghanistan in 2001. Civilians have been the main victims. There's no doubt about it. You can just do the counting. But they are excluded if they're victims of US militarism. And they're pushed to the forefront if they're victims of Putin's militarism. And yes, a lot of it is racial and a lot of it is ideological. But it's something that we have to understand, that both wings of the corporate media, whether it's the Fox News right wing or the MSNBC, NPR centrist wing of the corporate media, they share this Cold War mentality, which is that the US wears white hats, that the US is always on the side of democracy and human rights. And if we aren't, it's just by mistake and will be quickly corrected. And it's this insane ideology of the mainstream media that propels the nearly $900 billion Pentagon budget, which is where we started. It's the reason we don't have free or inexpensive higher ed and universal health care, unlike all these countries in other parts of the globe that do have those things, because we are policing the world. It's what Martin Luther King Jr. called the demonic suction tube. That's how he described the Pentagon taking all the funds that should be going to poor and working class and beleaguered middle class Americans and shifting it to these 5 or 6 military contracting corporations that all have their offices and their lobbyists in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. That's where the money's going. And you just can't have that discussed on MSNBC. It's not just Fox News or, on all of them, they will not discuss where is the wealth of our society going. And it's partly because they have this American exceptionalist ideology that always needs a Cold War enemy. On Fox, they emphasize China. Why aren't we being more tough on China? And on MSNBC and CNN, it's both China and Russia. But they're always in search of an enemy. And some of the main sponsors of the news are not just the pharmaceutical companies and the health insurance companies. They're actually military industrial companies. And Wall Street makes profits off of all of it. Wall Street loves the military budget. Wall Street loves our privatized education. Wall Street loves our privatized healthcare system. They're making profits on every sector of our economy.
Well, it's a grim note to end on, but he's telling the truth. So,
I mean, how do you follow that? What?
Organize.
Well,
we are organizing. That's why we're at rootsaction.org, is to organize against this privatization of our lives.
That's right. Well, I just want to thank you both, Hanieh Jodat, a strategist at Diffuse Nuclear War, and Jeff Cohen, one of the co-founders of Roots Action. Thanks to you both for being here, and I hope that we can see you again soon on the show. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank
Sam.
you.
Hi, and welcome to the Progressive Hub Show. My name is Jeffrey Sterling, former CIA officer, whistleblower, and contributor to Progressive Hub. I'm pleased today to have a conversation with NSA whistleblower Thomas Drake, who exposed fraud, waste, and abuse and illegal surveillance activities at NSA. And for his efforts, he was charged with violating the Espionage Act, same as I was. He was subsequently pled to a misdemeanor of misuse of a government computer, sort of whatever that means. Hi, Tom. Thank you, and thank you for coming on today.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Thanks for having me on the show.
Okay. Just to have a chat. You recently penned a piece on Roots Action. I think you titled it "The Ghost of J. Edgar Hoover Looms Over 2023," and you were talking about Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and it's looming either reauthorization or sunsetting. Can you give us a little perspective on what you were talking about there, and why we should really be paying attention to whether this act continues with authority?
It's the whole thing with Section 02. Really, this is 5 years, and then it has, as you said, comes up a reauthorization or sunset or possible modifications, right, before it's reauthorized. That all happens by the end of the year in terms of its enforce mechanism. But of course, they don't want to wait until the end of the year to continue or let's say sunset it. It really grew out of the FISA Amendments Act, and that goes back to 2008. That's where it all started, which actually has its own history in terms of sort of ex post facto, and I'll call it that, legalization of what were patently unlawful, unconstitutional surveillance programs that I was a part of in exposing. Sort of the
and FISA allows collection of foreign intelligence information.
Well, by definition, it's interesting. Even though there's a secret court within a secret appeals court, it was a compromise solution. But it's important to note, for those who will listen to your program, Jeffrey, that it really grew out of all of the scandals and all of the unlawful activities conducted by the U.S. government in secret, which in many cases, especially the surveillance side, have been ongoing for decades. Multiple programs across multiple agencies, all coming out the Church Committee, the Pike Committee, Bell Abzug, Rockefeller Commission. And so in 1978, they passed under President Carter the FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, as well as creating two standing committees for intelligence oversight. One housed in the House of Representatives, the other housed in the Senate.
Yeah, the HIPSI and SISI House.
HIPSI, shorthand HIPSI and SISI, of which I became quite familiar with as part of my own whistleblowing.
Same here.
Starting early on after 9/11. But again, these super secret programs. So FISA, but it had to be compliant with the Fourth Amendment. So in the event that a U.S. person, and when I was in the military, we had annual training, quite significant. It was annual training, just refresher training, to keep us apprised, because there were modifications made with FISA 5 times prior to 9/11 just to keep up with the times in terms of, or keep up with the technology. But it was always a Fourth Amendment standard.
Yes.
So you had to let's just say, if you violated that standard, there were actual criminal penalties under the U.S. Criminal Code, 18.
Yeah, and the Fourth Amendment, to preventing unlawful searches and seizures.
Unreasonable, and you had the probable cause standard. So it had to be reasonable, but when you're dealing with U.S. persons, which had its own unique definition, because it wasn't just natural born citizens, it wasn't just U.S. Citizens, it could also include all foreign nationals, and I'll say legal foreign nationals resident in the United States or resident in U.S. territories. Because I used to be part of sort of the surveillance regime in terms of listening in on communications of various countries in my past, and incredibly strict protocols were followed. And there was also a special procedure if you inadvertently captured communications involving U.S. persons, which, by the way, also included U.S. corporations. I don't want to forget that. They added that.
Yeah, I mean, a bit of a difference. So, I mean, when I was at CIA, it was hammered onto us. We don't do operations against U.S. citizens. We don't do operations against U.S. citizens. And that if one happened to fall in a net that we may have set outside of the U.S., there were so many standards. I used to also work in the Office of General Counsel at the CIA. There's so many boxes you had to check. So many, to make sure, we weren't violating the law. There was that sense that, we're protecting our country, but we can't violate the laws of our country in doing so.
Precisely, even in what you would call the secret side of government, right? So even in the secret side of government, in fact, you would say there was in essence a more higher standard, because it's in secret. There's things you can quote unquote get away with.
Yeah.
And so but the Fourth Amendment standard, there was no exception made, and even in terms of national security. Now, there were some interesting provisos. You could, in fact, start a warrantless. This is a sort of original FISA pre 9/11.
Yeah.
You could actually start a search and even engage in seizure, right? In terms of evidence, but you still had to get authorization, right? But this was normally if someone's life was at risk, or because of the circumstances involved. So that was a proviso built into the original FISA. So Section 702, and it's understandable post 9/11, and then of course all the revelations. Well, what do we put into place in the updated FISA that will allow us to still go after foreign nationals, and if they are communicating with U.S. persons, okay, and that includes U.S. corporations, we still have to follow the standard. Now, if it's just foreign, it was carte blanche. During my day, it's carte blanche.
Yeah.
And it's I think that in part, I'll just sort of parenthetically insert at the moment, when you had free license to pretty much collect anything outside of the U.S. person bubbles, I think you set up a tension, meaning that once those guardrails were lifted post 9/11, right? How are you going to put them back into place? Well, in part, when all this came out, and of course, I was part of that, the FISA Amendments Act consolidated and legalized a lot of that, and they had this special section. Now, it also does permit collecting information as part of the foreign national communicating with a U.S. person. The problem, just given the nature of technology, and this is partly why it's so incredibly seductive, if you have the power in secret, well, while we're here, and then they have these things called selectors, which go way beyond just a person, which allows you basically, just sort of take it all, right? We'll worry about it later. So NSA is the one that does that part. And it turns out under Section 02, the FBI is the primary government agency that has direct access to that database. Well, that database is filled with all kinds of information. And they've abused it. I'm going to cut to the chase. They just abused the privilege, because now it's like, well, maybe we can look for other things. What if it's possible crime being quote unquote, or suspicious activity? And yet you're not meeting the Fourth Amendment threshold, and you don't have to go through. In essence, it is a backdoor warrantless mechanism. You can't say it's inadvertent because, in essence, you've already given yourself permission. Okay.
So it's they're looking for a crime, even though there's no suspicion of a crime being there. They're looking for a crime, and it's all in interpretation. Especially if you get a motivated individual who just wants to, look good on his review coming up, he's going to find something, maybe make a connection that isn't really nefarious, but they can make it so by saying, "Oh, well, I found this connection. This U.S. citizen, I found this connection with this foreign national who might be of interest to us." So the checks and balances of the Fourth Amendment are, like you said, they're using a backdoor to get around it. And that's the nature of 702. What I found interesting about 702 is that it's what do they call it? Compelled assistance from electronic service providers. So it's not that they have goes to Google, FBI goes to Google and say, we want these records on such and such. With it being compelled, they can't say, well, we'll do it with a search warrant. There won't be a warrant. They're compelled to do so. And then if they refuse, of course, then it's going to be a secret court that says, no, you are compelled to do so by Section 702. Regardless of any of the process, where is the probable cause? Where is the Fourth Amendment in this? It's not there. And I think
it doesn't matter.
Point on that.
Or we pay lip service to it because you get into the titles, right? The various titles that apply, and so in essence, you get this gigantic carve out because it's for national security purposes. Now, this actually goes well beyond the original purpose of Section 702, which was really going after, quote unquote, threats to U.S. interests. Now, it could be national security interests, but it could be threats to other parts of U.S. interests, not just national security per se. This is sort of protecting who we are as a nation. Well, sort of the bad guys, quote unquote, just to use that phrase, the bad guys. Well, this goes well beyond just foreign, bad guys that have the label of foreign national.
Bad guys who we want to see as bad guys. The collectors, if they want to see someone as a bad guy, whatever, having every bit of information, having every bit of communication that they've had. If you want to see that person as an enemy, as a bad guy, there's nothing to change your mind in that sense.
Exactly. And remember, with selectors, and this is where it gets, I don't want to get it too much into the weeds on the technical side. a lot of people don't fully appreciate this. If you go to a particular node, I'll just say kind of a node or a location or a station on internet. I mean, again, there's actually specific language that's associated with a lot of this, but in terms of the net, you can sweep up because of the mechanisms of modern communications, which are, most of them are digital. There's still tons of analog systems out there and point to point, but most of the world's communications have gone digital. So you have vast streams of data where it's a mix of everything.
Yeah, it's incredible.
The US, I'm familiar in part with some of the earlier variations of the system, have extraordinarily wide access, not just on a nation state level, but also in partnership with certain other countries. So the access to foreign national information is quite extraordinary. It was inevitable. It's just inevitable, unlike the earlier days, that you would in fact come across lots and lots of quote unquote U.S. person information.
Yeah. And I think in post 9/11, I think the danger, and what we're talking here is, where does privacy fit within this rubric? I mean, we've just hit the 10-year anniversary of the Snowden's revelations, about mass surveillance. And so, and the reaction, of course, other than government, making the enemy number one out of Snowden. But okay, let's talk about, the facts of mass surveillance. What legal protections do we have? Where does privacy fit within this? And we have things like Section 02, which, and I like the term that you used in your piece. We're talking about privacide. It's the intentional killing of privacy by government initiatives, all in the name of national security.
They just want the data. Bottom line, you strip all of sections and FISA and acts and all the procedural process issues, right? Strip all that aside. The bottom line is the Fourth Amendment is in the way of our ability to quote unquote collect information on an unfettered basis. And the trend line is we just keep removing whatever little is left of those guardrails.
Yeah.
And to me, Section 702 basically holds the Fourth Amendment in contempt. It makes a mockery, I'll just say it that way, it makes a mockery of any sense of quote unquote personal privacy at a person level.